What We Cannot See Pioneers Season 2 Episode 9 Part 2. Icarex ran up to the other Black Gear Bionicles, standing elsewhere in the army. They were tightly grasping their weapons and watching as Kopaka and a few of his followers battled back the attacks of the monsters that had emerged from the Byasein in the distance. Icarex said to the other Bionicles, "We have a plan for defeating the Byasein." "Oh, wonderful," said one of the Bionicles. "Is it going to work?" "We don't know, but this is the best plan we've come up with," Icarex replied. "I need all of you to help us with this." Icarex then pointed back to the tentacles extending out of the Byasein onto the ground and the tentacles rising up into the ceiling. Icarex said to the Bionicles, "If we could cut all of those tentacles coming out of the Byasein, we think we might be able to kill it. The minifigs are going to use their firearms to sever the tentacles coming out of the top of the Byasein's body. The rest of you will need to cut the tentacles coming out of the Byasein on the ground. Kopaka has taken a small group to engage the monsters that are coming out of the Byasein. We will need you to try and cut off the tentacles attached to them as well. That will kill the smaller monsters." "Your plan better work, Icarex," one of the Bionicles said threateningly. "It's not my plan," Icarex informed them. "It's Gavla's." "Really?" the Bionicle replied. "If it works, I'll forget all the times we caught her spying on Black Gear. Let her know that." Icarex shook his head in disbelief. "Go already!" Icarex yelled, and the Bionicle warriors all frowned at him, but obeyed. Near where Gutnoa's carrier truck was, the minifig soldiers were lining up their firearms and aiming them up into the air, the tentacles extending into the ceiling of the garage. Gutnoa had told his commanders about the plan, and they had organized their troops accordingly. In the distance, Kopaka and some of his followers battled the two monsters that had emerged from the Byasein, while the rest of the Black Gear gang began meticulously severing all of the tentacles of the Byasein lying on the ground. Colonel Carlos, one of the first minifigs to encounter a monster and live to tell about it, had managed to escape that trial with one remaining soldier of his. This soldier was still alive, the last of the Colony Confidence colonial troopers. At the time when no one knew what the Byasein was, the presence in the new land was merely referred to as the Phantom. This last Confidence colonial trooper shouted into the air most suddenly, "The Phantom must die!" Carlos immediately recognized this. The Phantom. Whether or not the other soldiers in the army knew that the Byasein was originally called the Phantom or not, they all repeated this chant of Carlos's soldier. The chant erupted throughout the army, and before General George could give the order, all of the minifig soldiers began firing their weapons up at the tentacles of the Byasein. The Bionicles were fighting the monsters and cutting the ground tentacles, while the minifigs fired their weaponry up at the tentacles leading into the ceiling. This was the climax of their journey. This was the final battle against the Byasein. General George picked up a handheld radio and spoke through it on a channel linked with the radio on the mobile armored mortar. He had a unique idea on how to destroy many of the tentacles reaching up into the ceiling. The driver of the mobile armored mortar responded, and the sounds of great quantities of gunfire fed into his radio speakers. "Driver," General George addressed the MAM driver, "how many artillery shells do you have left?" "Only 2, General," the road driver replied through the radio. "I want you to aim both of them at the tentacles rising out of the Byasein. If just one of your shells hits one tentacle, the explosion might destroy a great many more with it." "Yes, General, out," the driver said, and he hung up the radio. Icarex went over to Gavla, who was standing behind the minifig army. He stood before her, anger in his voice. He said to her, "Why aren't you doing anything?" "I'm strategizing," Gavla shot back. "Look there." Gavla pointed a finger at another region of the Byasein's base. A new monster was beginning to emerge. "Go to the other Black Gear Bionicles," she yelled at Icarex. "Order some of them to break off and engage this new monster while the rest continue severing the ground tentacles." Icarex felt rage build up inside of him at Gavla's authoritativeness, but he obeyed, knowing that this was no time for argument. As Icarex ran over to the Black Gear Bionicles, he saw in the distance one of the monsters Kopaka's squad was fighting. That monster killed one of the Bionicle warriors. They would need more men to hold off the monsters longer. That, or someone to help them kill the monsters. Icarex reached one of the Black Gear Bionicles, who was doing his best to cut the tentacles on the ground. Urgently, Icarex said to him, "You, I want you and 3 others to circle around and focus on cutting off the tentacles that these submonsters are attached to. The Bionicle nodded and summoned nearby comrades to aid Kopaka's team in killing the monsters. A massive explosion sounded off as the mobile armored mortar fired one of its shells into the air, aimed at the cluster of tentacles rising out of the top of the Byasein. The shell just missed, whizzing past the tentacles and exploding on a wall behind the Byasein. No doubt it would try one last time with its final shell. The minifig soldiers were having mixed success with trying to shoot the tentacles coming out of the top of the Byasein. They were able to shoot many, but the tentacles kept moving as the Byasein slowly pulsated in its place. Aiming was incredibly difficult, and often successful shots were nothing more than lucky shots. The mobile armored mortar had loaded its final artillery shell into its cannon. The driver did his best to reposition his machine in order to hit the tentacles in the air. The driver took a deep breath before pressing the right buttons on his console inside the MAM. When he was as sure as he could be, he fired. Another explosion from the mobile armored mortar blasted into the air, and many minifig soldiers stopped their shooting in order to watch the shell. A hit. The artillery shell smashed into one of the tentacles rising out of the Byasein. The explosion resulted from this impact was massive. Fire and smoke ballooned out from where the shell had hit. It burned at least 15 tentacles near it to a crisp, and the other half of the tentacles went limp and hung from the ceiling, separated from their central source of power. The minifig soldiers on the ground erupted in a roar of cheers as their task had become much easier. About a dozen tentacles remained rising out of the Byasein. With increased morale and sinister grins on their faces, the minifig soldiers fired all of their weapons into the air, hoping for enough hits to cut down all tentacles. Colonel Carlos equipped his own customized sniper rifle and began firing himself at the tentacles. General George, Captain Mike, and many other military officers pulled out their own pistols and began firing as well. Even Prime Minister Stanley Gitanoa began firing his pistol. This was everyone's fight. Below, the Bionicles were doing their part. Now 3 monsters had emerged from the Byasein, and someone said they thought they saw a 4th emerging along with them. The newly emerged monster almost moved to attack the minifigs and their emplacement, but a team of Black Gear Bionicles intercepted it and began fighting it. Unfortunately, the newest monster was made up of a part of a small minifig artillery weapon used to defend many bases out in the new land. This piece of artillery had fired a single shot at the minifigs, and it hit the ground near 6 minifig soldiers, creating a blast that killed all of them. Icarax was helping the group of Bionicles in cutting off the ground tentacles. The process was incredibly slow as there was a massive amount of tentacles on the ground. Icarax, though, had sent out a team to focus on killing the sub-monsters by cutting their tentacles, while the others engaged the monsters. The army was divided, but it was working in unity. While the process was slow, the New Land Army was slowly winning its battle against the Byasein. Another roar exploded into the air. It was the Byasein, and it sounded as though it were crying in agony. The army took this as a good sign, as it was likely that they were hurting the Byasein. "One down!" came a Bionicle voice in the midst of the gunfire and the slashing of many weapons. Several members of the army looked as one of the smaller monsters that had emerged from the Byasein came crashing down to the ground, positively dead. One of the minifig soldiers shouted to the others, "Only 2 more tentacles to go!" He pointed into the air at the last 2 tentacles attached to the ceiling. This brought reassurance to many of the members of the army, but the commanders of the minifigs still weren't even sure the plan would work. But Gavla was. Gavla was standing behind the entire army, not attracting any attention from anyone. The grimmest of smiles was upon her face. The Byasein had given her its immense power, but she had told the New Land Army what to do in order to kill it. She watched the New Land Army battle around the Byasein, cutting it apart and working in efficient cooperation to bring the beast down. But the fact amused her that in the end, by killing the Byasein, the New Land Army will have served her own wishes. She was manipulating the most powerful amassment of military strength in the history of the Bionicle and minifig races, and they didn't even know it. The Byasein was currently the only being in existence more powerful than herself. By killing it, the New Land Army would give her the ultimate monopoly over the powers she now possessed. Another of the remaining two sub-monsters fell dead to the ground as the separate Bionicle team went behind and cut its tentacle. Icarax and his men were almost done cutting all of the ground tentacles. The minifig soldiers had one more tentacle attached to the ceiling to cut off, and it would easily fall now that every one of their weapons would be aimed at it. The Byasein continued letting out distorted screams and roars of despair and pain. The final tentacle attached to the ceiling was at last severed as a minifig rifle bullet pierced it. The minifigs cheered and raised their weapons in the air. The Byasein was near defeat. Prime Minister Stanley Gutanoa sat on his own truck, his pistol out of bullets. He looked at the New Land Army as it worked together to bring down the most terrifying menace these two races had ever faced in their long histories. He smiled warmly. Together, the minifigs and Bionicles were capable of incredible feats. Gutanoa knew that while King Archimod never made it this far, he himself had. For your sake, King Archimod, I promise to work for peace in the years after this conflict, Gutanoa thought to himself. You and I would have made a great team as leaders. But as long as I live, I will work for the betterment of both our races. Only a few more ground tentacles remained uncut, and Icarax and the other Black-Ear Bionicles were very close to cutting them all. Minifig soldiers pointed to the Byasein, seeing another sub-monster slowly begin to push out of the mountain of parts. But at the rate Icarax and his fellows were going, it would never make it. Gavla saw how close the New Land Army was to killing the Byasein. In these last few moments of the battle, she took the time to contact the Byasein just as it had contacted her earlier. Using her mental link with the Byasein, she began speaking to it via her own thoughts. You are at the end of your existence, Gavla told the Byasein. There was a pause, but eventually the Byasein spoke back into her thoughts. I am, and I will die here within minutes, the Byasein replied through thought. Do as I have asked, Gavla. Destroy the minifigs. Oh, I'll do as you have asked, Gavla replied through thought. But I'm not doing it for you. Gavla's mental link told her that she had alarmed the Byasein. Gavla continued. You were a fool to give me these powers and the knowledge of your kind, Byasein. I will use it to gain supremacy for myself, and I will kill the minifigs for my own legacy, not for yours. You predicted early on that you would eventually die at our hands. You never predicted that it was I who would use the knowledge you gave me of your kind to tell this army how to defeat you. Today, Byasein, you die by my hand. There was a fierce and angry roar that exploded from the Byasein. The New Land Army was unaware that this roar was a response to the hidden conversation Gavla was having with the Byasein. You traitor! You liar! The Byasein replied in his thoughts, his voice a scream in Gavla's mind. I'm not surprised at how naive and stupid you were, Byasein, Gavla said to the Byasein in her mind. After all, you did start out as a minifig. The Byasein began roaring again, and this roar was the loudest roar anyone had ever heard. It was a long, dragged-out, ferocious roar, unlike any the army had ever heard before. Gavla knew it was because the Byasein had finally realized that she had betrayed it. Icarax and the Bionicles had one final tentacle to cut. Icarax was the one closest to it. Raising his weapon high in the air, he brought it down hardly against the tentacle, easily cutting it in half. Now, every single tentacle had been cut. Abruptly, the Byasein stopped its roar. The entire garage went silent. Ever since the New Land Army had seen the Byasein, it had been slowly pulsating in its place, but now it was completely still. Icarax and the Bionicles he was working with almost naturally began distancing themselves from the Byasein, walking backward while keeping their eyes on it to see what would happen next. Gavla began searching the information the Byasein had transferred to her for an answer as to what would happen after they had cut every tentacle. But finally, she uncovered the information. The Byasein would then explode. The ground beneath the army began rumbling once again, but this time it was a far more violent rumble. From the body of the Byasein, small chunks of bionicle and minifig parts flew out and into the air of the garage, colliding hard with the ground. One piece landed very near the minifig soldiers, and they jumped back in alarm. Everyone had gone from a feeling of accomplishment to one of panic. Gavla, knowing what was about to happen, shouted at the top of her lungs, "Take cover!" Everyone then interpreted this as a sign that the Byasein was about to explode. As the ground began trembling, everyone began running as fast as their bodies would permit away from the center of the garage and the Byasein. The minifigs sitting on their carrier trucks leapt off their seats and onto the ground, running away as well. There was no time to turn the carrier trucks around, and they were completely abandoned as everyone in the army tried to find things in the garage to hide behind. In a split second, the loudest explosion that anyone in the army had ever heard before sounded off, and had they turned around to look at the Byasein, they would have seen the once titanic beast blast apart into 1,000 of small chunks of minifig and bionicle parts. These chunks flew into the air in all directions and began falling on the ground around the fleeing members of the army. As massive groupings of the parts came hurtling down, the fleeing soldiers did their best to jump out of the way. Some made it, while others were utterly crushed beneath the falling parts. The mobile armored mortar, left behind by its driver, was destroyed as a giant piece of minifig architecture smashed down upon it. The bionicles and minifigs alike were running and scrambling for safety, while many of both races were killed in the spray of shrapnel from the Byasein. Prime Minister Stanley Utanoa was running as fast as his own body would allow, his escorts having abandoned him to flee themselves. A shadow came over Utanoa in the distance, and in absolute horror he turned around to see falling directly toward him a massive cluster of bionicle parts. He knew then there was no escape. His life of leading the minifig race into the new land, and in the process forcing them unintentionally into this conflict with the Byasein, flashed before his very eyes. He had brought his people to this bizarre world, and many died because of his decision to migrate here. But at least he had also helped them defeat the source of their plight. "I accept this fate," Utanoa thought with true calmness in his mind, as the giant chunk of parts began descending upon him. Utanoa slowed his running down to a halt, and he turned to face the parts, hurtling toward him. He did nothing to resist, as he was utterly crushed by the parts that fell onto him. Eventually, all of the parts from the explosion of the Byasein had descended onto the ground, and the rumbling of the ground had stopped. From their places of cover, from the rain of the shrapnel, bionicle and minifig soldiers in the army emerged back into the open of the garage. Where once nothing but the Byasein stood, there was now a wasteland of 1,000 little bits and pieces of bionicle and minifig parts. One by one, everyone still alive in the army moved inward and gathered at the center of the garage. They looked at one another in complete amazement. Everything both of their peoples had ever been through since they entered the new land had left the army speechless. They had defeated a being the likes of which none of them could comprehend, a god in its own right. Despite the overcoming power of the Byasein, the unity of the bionicle and minifig races had brought it down, and in this garage was proof of their victory. They were pioneers of a new age. But the moment of elation was brief indeed, as it was eventually realized that not everyone who had entered the garage was still standing. Many had died in these last few moments. As it was soon learned, Prime Minister Stanley Utanoa was one of them. Both races were without official leaders. The Byasein had been defeated and the new land was at peace. But where would these two races go from this point onward? Before I end this, guys, I thought I'd clear something up. If you remember in Season 1, most of the first half of it takes place in the garage. There's Bionicle and, Lego parts all scattered around the garage, and it's kind of a mess. That is what was part of the Byasein. When the Byasein exploded, all those parts flew out across the garage. So, That is how I explained that. And I thought I'd clear that up for you guys. Anyway, one more episode to go, and we're done. To be concluded in episode 10,